Have you ever found yourself, really struggling to understand someone's reaction after something difficult happens? Maybe they didn't react quite how you expected them to.
Yeah, or maybe wondered why someone didn't speak up straight away when something felt
Yeah.
just fundamentally wrong.
Exactly. And these aren't just abstract questions, are they?
No, not at all. They get right to the heart of, well, human behavior, memory, trauma,
Hmm.
and how we navigate really sensitive interactions,
Mm,
especially within relationships and social circles.
absolutely. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're sort of peeling back the layers on a real legal case from Singapore that really illustrates these very issues, things like consent, credibility, delayed responses, and the aftermath when trust just completely breaks down.
Right. And our source material for this deep dive, it's pretty substantial. We've got a highly detailed judgment from the Singapore District Court, runs to many, many pages, and also a concise news article that summarizes that judgment.
And we're focusing on a civil suit here, specifically a claim for battery.
That's right. But this wasn't, a simple push or shove kind of battery. The core allegation involved non-consensual digital penetration. And the claimant said this happened years before she actually brought the case.
It's a really challenging and sensitive area, isn't it? Legally, personally.
It is. But the outcome is significant, and we should say this up front. The claimant won her civil suit against her former colleague.
Okay. So, our mission for this deep dive is, well, pretty precise. We want to take these sources, the judge's really deep look into the evidence and the summary reporting, and just unpack everything that's in them.
Yeah, understand the background, the details, the judge's reasoning, how the law trying to grapple with these incredibly sensitive things like consent, reporting after a delay, and assessing who to believe over time.
We'll also look at the impact of, wider social movements, the challenges when someone claims they just can't remember things, and what protections there might be against, well, potentially false claims. This whole area of potential fraud or misrepresentation, even if not explicitly labeled that way.
Exactly. And ultimately, we want to draw out the key lessons from this specific Singaporean case that are relevant for you, for relationships, trust, interactions, especially in a multicultural society like Singapore.
Consider this a deep exploration into how the legal system tries to make sense of these really complicated human situations, hopefully giving you a more informed perspective on the dynamics when trust breaks down.
Yeah, understanding the nuances, the difficulties in proving things, and, the often nonlinear path people take after experiencing something like this.
Okay, let's start unpacking this. Where should we begin? Maybe with the background of the people involved, how their relationship sort of evolved before the incident.
Sounds good. So the claimant and defendant, they were initially colleagues. They both worked at MindDeath here in Singapore. This was back around 2015.
Right. And this started a romantic relationship.
Yes, the judgment says around June 2015,
Yeah.
and this relationship included sexual intimacy between April and December of that year. So there's a clear history there, romantic connection, consensual sexual relations.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Even then, there was some tension.
Yeah, the sources mention that. Apparently, the defendant wanted to be open about their relationship at work, but the claimant, she had serious reservations.
Worried about office gossip or.
Kind of. Concerned about how colleagues would see them if they knew, and also how a potential breakup could make things really awkward, maybe even damage their working relationship or affect their shared group of friends.
Those are very real worries, especially in, a close-knit work or social environment like Singapore can be. Wanting discretion at work, worrying about ripple effects.
Definitely. So, because of these tensions, she decided to end the romantic part of their relationship. That was in December 2015.
Okay, but they didn't just stop talking.
No, not at all. The judgment specifically says they agreed to remain friends, which was partly necessary because they still worked together, but also because they had a big overlap in their social circles. Lots of mutual friends.
And they stayed pretty close, even as friends.
Apparently so. The sources say they still had feelings for each other, kept interacting socially, chatting regularly, hanging out, even going to fitness classes together.
So this context is important, isn't it? This continuation of a close, friendly relationship, but with maybe some unresolved feelings bubbling underneath. They weren't strangers when the incident happened.
Exactly. That's crucial for understanding the night of July 10th, 2016. They were navigating this complex post-breakup friendship within a shared social world.
Right. Which brings us to that specific night. What happened?
Well, the claimant was out with some colleagues for dinner and drinks. Later on, the group decided to move to a nightclub, Bang Bang.
And the defendant joined them there.
Yes, and it was actually the claimant who invited him. She sent him a text message asking him to come along. He showed up around 2 a.m., and they spent some time together at the club, had some drinks.
Okay. And then later, they shared a taxi home.
Yeah, around 3 a.m., the night was winding down, people started heading off. Since they live in the same general direction, they decided to share a cab.
And things became intimate again during that ride.
That's what the evidence suggests. They started making out in the taxi. And the claimant's account, as laid out in the judgment, is that at some point during this ride, she invited the defendant back to her place.
And was the invitation specific? Like, for sex?
Yes, that's a key point, the judgment notes. At that stage, she explicitly invited him back for sex. Consent was clearly given at that point.
Okay. So they get back to her apartment.
Right. And they continued being physically intimate in the living room for a bit.
But then, according to her account, something changed. She had second thoughts.
Yes. Her testimony was that she went to her bedroom, planning to take a shower. And while she was in the shower, she said she sobered up quite a bit
Ah.
and started reflecting on the situation. She realized she didn't actually want to restart the romantic relationship, which she felt having sex might complicate or even signify.
And she also realized she just didn't want to have sex with him specifically in that moment.
Right. She regretted inviting him over.
So, a definite change of mind while she was alone and sobering up. Consent withdrawn. What happened when she came out?
She came out of the bathroom and, according to her testimony, she immediately told the defendant that he should go home, that sex was not happening. She clearly asked him to leave her apartment.
How did he take that? Being told to leave after being invited back?
Her account is that he was, well, taken aback. He refused to leave and got quite emotional, started pleading with her, trying to convince her to get back into a romantic relationship with him again.
So it turned into an argument.
A heated conversation, yeah. She said he was persistent, questioning her, disagreeing with her decision. This apparently went on for about 10 minutes.
And she wasn't changing her mind.
No. She testified that eventually she felt the whole conversation was pointless. She wasn't going to revisit the relationship, and his pleading wasn't making her want him to stay.
So she tried to end the argument.
Exactly. She said she was exasperated, and she firmly told him to see himself out, basically. Repeated her demand for him to leave.
And then what? Did she leave the room?
No. She went into her bedroom where the lights were still on. She got into her bed and deliberately turned away from him, lying on her right side with her back facing him.
Trying to send a clear signal.
That was her intention, according to her testimony. To signal unequivocally, conversation over, I'm done, I want you gone.
So she'd verbally told him to leave multiple times and now used body language to reinforce it, but he still didn't leave.
According to her testimony, no. She said he continued pleading for a few more seconds, and then, suddenly, he took off his shirt and pants and climbed into the bed beside her.
Whoa! Even though she'd explicitly told him to leave and was facing away from him?
Yes. She testified that before she could really react to him getting into the bed, he forcefully wrapped his arms around her from behind, restraining her.
Okay. And this is where the alleged battery, the non-consensual act, occurred.
It is. She described struggling, trying to push his arms away, but she couldn't break free from his hold. She testified that he then used his left hand, reached under the waistband of her pajama shorts, and inserted one finger into her vagina.
Which she stated was completely without her consent.
Entirely without her consent, yes. That was her allegation.
What happened immediately after that?
She recounted being in a state of, well, intense shock and outrage. She managed to free one arm, pushed his hand away, shoved him off her body, and sat bolt upright in bed.
And told him to leave again.
Immediately demanded he leave, shouting, "Get out."
Did he go then?
She said he didn't say anything, just scoffed, grabbed his clothes, got dressed angrily, and left the apartment, slamming the front door behind him.
Slammed the door. So angry departure.
Yeah. And apparently, he actually came back briefly a few moments later. She described him knocking or ringing the bell. She opened the door just a crack, tentatively, and he apparently barged past her into the living room to grab some personal things he left there before leaving again, still in a huff.
Wow. Okay, so that's the claimant's detailed account of the night. From consensual invitation to clear withdrawal of consent, his refusal to leave, the emotional pleading, her disengagement, and then the alleged non-consensual physical contact.
Right. And the communication that happened immediately after he left is really critical. It was scrutinized heavily in the judgment.
Ah, yes, the text messages. Sent just minutes after he left her apartment.
Yes, he sent a series of messages between about 4:24 and 4:32 a.m.
What did they say?
They started with things like, "Stop stringing me along if this is going nowhere,"
Yeah.
which clearly shows his frustration about her decision that night.
Okay.
But then, crucially, he sent text saying, "I apologize that I got out of control again," followed by, "But let's avoid putting ourselves in those situations again." Yeah.
That phrasing. Again. And those situations. That sounds pretty significant given her allegations.
It certainly caught the judge's attention. Now, the claimant didn't reply right away. Her first text back was hours later, around midday.
And what did she say? Just sorry.
Yes, her first response was simply sorry. Which seems odd, right? But then there was a longer exchange where she made some comments that seemed almost mundane, like about her bed and hair.
Like, yeah, me too. No one allowed on my bed unless clean. And your hair was dirty humph because you were at the club. Trying to make light of it, maybe. Or deflect.
That's one way to look at it, and something the judge had to consider against her later explanation. But then she sent a text saying, "I think we could have enjoyed each other last night and had fun, and I wanted to." But immediately followed it with, "Not for the wrong reasons."
Not for the wrong reasons. That's interesting phrasing. How did he reply to that?
He said, "I don't understand," and asked, "What do you mean, not for the wrong reasons?" The conversation continued, with her trying to explain her state of mind, saying things like bad judgment and "I'm not in the best place in my life to make decisions that affect people's emotions."
So she's directly referencing her change of mind.
Yes, she explicitly said, "I sobered up and thought about it in the shower, so I couldn't."
Okay, so her texts, while starting with that sorry and the slightly odd comments, do actually circle back to the events, referencing the potential for sex, but clearly stating it didn't happen because she changed her mind after sobering up.
Exactly. And later that day, he sent another message related to her emotional state, saying something like, "I still stand by what I said, be too tebble. Whatever your emotional state is now, it's better for both of us if you just let me in."
Still trying to push for a relationship, it sounds like, despite everything she'd said.
That's how it could be interpreted.
Yeah.
Now, this immediate communication is fascinating because her texts apologizing, the mundane stuff, then talking about bad judgment, seem contradictory. Which brings us to her explanation for why she texted sorry after something like that.
Yeah, why apologize? The defense must have jumped on that.
They did, but the judgment details her explanation, which actually aligns with a lot of what we know about trauma responses. She testified. She apologized instinctively, like a coping mechanism, an attempt to de-escalate, avoid more conflict, just get back to some kind of normalcy.
So in that moment, she hadn't fully processed it as assault.
Not according to her testimony and the source, no. She knew it was non-consensual, but in that state of shock and confusion, mixed with her existing feelings for him and their past intimacy, she initially felt sort of responsible for upsetting him. Maybe blamed herself for inviting him over, then changing her mind.
Shock, confusion, denial, self-blame. That sounds like a plausible trauma response.
It is. And this became central to the judge's assessment later. Now, the defendant, he offered a completely different take on his own texts.
What was his explanation for apologizing for getting out of control again?
He claimed it referred only to the heated argument they had after she told him to leave, not to any physical contact. And he argued his message about avoiding those situations again was about avoiding the temptation for a longer-term relationship, not avoiding physical intimacy, because he knew she wasn't ready for commitment.
So completely sidestepping the physical allegation.
Yes, but the judge did a really careful analysis of these texts, looking at the whole context, and the judge found the defendant's explanation more convenient than credible.
Why? What made the judge doubt his version?
Well, the judge found the texts actually corroborated key parts of the claimant's story. His immediate apology, saying he got out of control again, mentioning, "She'd left the moment you told me to," all that strongly supported her narrative. She invited him, changed her mind, told him to leave. He refused, they argued, and he was on her bed in a situation needing an apology.
And the judge felt out of control was more likely about a physical act than just an argument.
Yes, especially with the word again. The judge connected this to previous texts from January 31st, 2016.
He'd apologized for something similar before.
Yes. Back then, he'd texted about feeling lousy and guilty and apologized for not holding back when they were drunk. His own explanation for that apology was regret over getting physically and emotionally closer when they weren't committed, needing to keep distance.
Ah, I see.
So the judge interpreted that earlier apology as likely being about regretting sex when they weren't committed. Therefore, the judge reasoned the later apology on July 10th, saying out of control again and avoiding those situations, read alongside her texts about sobering up and bad judgment, strongly suggested his regret was tied to the physical events after she withdrew consent, not just an argument or his desire for a relationship.
Wow, that's detailed reasoning. Using his own past words in the context to find his later explanation less believable.
Exactly. The judge found those contemporaneous texts highly persuasive in supporting her account over his interpretation. But his main attack on her credibility wasn't just the immediate text, it was her behavior after July 10th.
Right, the fact that she continued to interact with him, sometimes in ways that seemed friendly, even intimate, years later. The defense argued that just wouldn't happen if she'd been assaulted.
Precisely. He pointed to a lot of examples from the source. Her inviting him shopping or meeting up just a month later, in August 2016, asking for a wake-up call, inviting him to a house party.
And didn't she invite him to spend the night at her place in September 2016, only 2 months after the alleged assault, and greeted him in her underwear?
Yes, that was a key point for the defense. It seems incredibly hard to reconcile on the surface, doesn't it?
It really does.
They also highlighted they kept participating in social activities with mutual friends at least 10 times after the incident. She invited him to dinner in January 2017, and that same month, she apparently suggested they give their romantic relationship one last shot.
And there were other things, too. Sharing car rides, asking if he'd try to do anything if she was in her underwear, saying she was sad, he felt distant. It paints a picture of ongoing, sometimes even flirtatious, contact.
It does. And from the defendant's viewpoint, this was just completely inconsistent with her claim of being assaulted just months before.
So how did she explain this behavior that seems so contradictory?
Her explanation, which the judge looked at really closely, came back to her state of mind right after the incident. The shock, denial, confusion, that really pervasive self-blame. She testified she struggled intensely to even articulate what happened. She said she didn't really have the words for it until much later, around mid-2017.
Finding the words, that's powerful, suggests a real difficulty in processing.
It does. She described being in denial, knowing it was non-consensual but unable to really grasp it as sexual assault, especially because it was someone she knew, had been intimate with, still cared about somehow. She felt ashamed, guilty, like maybe she'd provoked him or was responsible because she invited him over and then changed her mind.
So faced with all that, her coping strategy was what? Pretend it didn't happen.
Essentially, yes. Try to normalize the relationship. Act like nothing major occurred. Keep interacting, hoping to push the incident out of her mind. Avoid a massive confrontation. Avoid blowing up their shared social circle. And just trying to feel normal again herself.
So the continued contact was a kind of survival mechanism, an attempt to contain the trauma rather than proof it didn't happen.
That was her argument. She admitted sometimes avoiding him, but also made those confusing romantic advances, even suggesting getting back together in Jan 2017. She explained that as coming from confusion and a warped belief, her words, that maybe if he loved her, the incident wouldn't matter or could be excused.
And the social pressure? Was that a factor?
She highlighted that too. Pressure from mutual friends to invite him to things, like a birthday party. Cutting him off completely would have made socializing incredibly difficult, maybe alienated her from friends, which she just couldn't handle while dealing with the trauma internally.
That paints a really complex picture. Internal turmoil clashing with external social pressures, especially in a place like Singapore, where those circles can be really tight.
Absolutely. And this is where the judge's evaluation of her post-incident behavior is so crucial. It speaks directly to understanding trauma responses and assessing credibility.
So how did the judge handle it? Did the judge think her behavior undermined her claim?
No. Crucially, the judge did not. The judge explicitly tackled the misconception that assault victims all act in one predictable, stereotypical way. The judgment actually cited other Singaporean cases that established that things like delayed reporting, continued contact with the perpetrator, and a whole range of emotional responses, even ones far from despair, are not uncommon and don't automatically make a complainant unreliable.
That's such an important legal point, isn't it? Recognizing the reality of trauma, the idea that there's a right way to react is just a harmful stereotype.
Exactly. And the judge found the claimant's explanations plausible when seen through that overlapping lens of confusion, denial, and self-blame. The judge felt her behavior, while maybe counterintuitive if you expect a stereotype, was understandable and credible given the context. Their close relationship, prior consensual sex, the tight social circle. Trying to normalize things and avoid social fallout was seen as a believable coping strategy for someone in her state.
The defense also tried to use her background against her, didn't they? saying because she was overseas educated and had prior sexual experience, she should have reacted differently.
Yes, they argued her response shouldn't count as atypical, but the judge flatly rejected that. Said there was zero evidence that education or sexual history dictates how someone processes sexual assault trauma. And the judge firmly repeated, prior consensual sex does not imply consent for a specific act on a specific night, especially after consent is withdrawn.
Did the judge find anything else that supported her pattern of processing trauma?
Yes, interestingly, the judge noted another incident she experienced later, in 2020, involving unwanted touching. The judge observed she also took months to process and disclose that later incident.
Ah, so it suggested a consistent personal pattern for her.
Right. The judge saw it as lending consistency to her explanation for the long delay regarding the 2016 incident. It showed how she personally tended to grapple with and disclose traumatic experiences over time.
So, the judge's detailed analysis concluded her continued interaction and delay weren't inconsistent with her having been assaulted, considering her psychological state, the relationship, the social context. That's a major legal affirmation of varied trauma responses.
It really is. It hammers home that a victim's behavior afterwards shouldn't be used to simplistically discredit their claims, which leads us to her eventual journey towards taking legal action. That was a long road, too.
What was the turning point? What made her finally come forward formally years later?
According to the source, a really significant moment was her exposure to the Me Too movement. Sometime in mid-2017, she started reading stories online, hearing from other survivors.
Ah, so the impact of wider social conversations. Point
Yeah.
two.
Absolutely. Engaging with those stories, she had this sudden, profound realization. It helped her find the words, the framework she lacked to understand her own experience. She finally fully processed that what happened on July 10, 2016 was sexual assault, regardless of who did it or their past relationship.
Because she understood the core issue was the lack of consent.
Precisely. Reading other experiences helped her untangle the act itself from her complicated feelings about him and their history. She grasped that knowing someone, trusting them, having been intimate before, none of that mattered as consent was withdrawn and the act happened anyway. Even then, the source notes, she still struggled with shame and guilt.
So it took time and external validation from movements like Me Too for her to really label and understand it. When did she first tell anyone after this realization?
Much later again, January 2018, according to the source, she confided in some university friends, Rachel, Weiping, Suiping, and also a colleague from MindDef, Jeremy, around the same time.
What was their reaction? Was it supportive?
This is a tough part. The judge found her account of their reactions was corroborated by letters she wrote later, and her description was, well, not the support she'd hoped for. The source mentions silence, the atmosphere turning dull, reactions implying she was partly to blame for leading him on. This came out particularly in letters she wrote later in Nava 2020 to Rachel and another friend, Eugene.
Oh, that must have been incredibly difficult. Reinforcing the self-blame she already felt. It really highlights the challenges victims face even when they do speak up.
Absolutely. It helps explain why she waited even longer to take formal steps. Those letters she wrote in 2020 were partly her way of processing, years later, and partly expressing hurt over those initial reactions.
So, after those initial disclosures and the difficult responses, when did things become more formal, reporting it?
The timeline is still quite delayed. March 2021, nearly 5 years after the incident. She wrote an email to MindDef senior management, mentioned 3 unpleasant encounters, one being a sexual assault by a civilian officer, didn't name him initially, though.
And MindDef encouraged her to report it formally.
Yes, strongly encouraged her to report to the SF Military Police Command, MPC. She did that in March 2021. But because the defendant was a civilian, not under MPC purview, the MPC then encouraged her to go to the Singapore Police Force, SPF.
And she filed a police report.
Yes, also March 2021. The source says MPC actually escorted her to do it.
What came of the police investigation?
In February 2022, the police decided not to take any further action against the defendant.
How did the judge in the civil case view that police decision? Did it mean the judge thought her claim was weak?
No, that's a crucial legal distinction. The judge specifically noted that no evidence was presented in the civil trial about why the police decided not to act. So the judge found the police decision was not determinative of whether her claim was truthful in the civil suit. It would be speculative, the judge said, to assume her allegations were untrue just because the police didn't proceed. Criminal and civil systems have different standards, different considerations.
Right, that makes sense. Different burdens of proof. So after the police case closed, she pursued the civil suit.
Yes, she got legal advice and filed this civil suit in July 2022. Her motivation, the source suggests, was seeking recourse herself through the civil system, especially after her MindF email apparently leaked, causing more social distress.
What a long and difficult path. Okay, let's get into the legal analysis in the civil trial itself. What standard of proof did she have to meet?
In Singapore civil cases, it's the balance of probabilities. Basically, she had to prove it was more likely than not more than 50% likely that the battery occurred, as she claimed.
But the judge mentioned a nuance for serious allegations like this. Point 4, the burden of proof.
Exactly. While the standard is still balance of probabilities, the judge cited case law saying for serious allegations, the court needs cogent evidence. Clear, convincing, persuasive evidence. It doesn't change the probability required, still 50%, but it means the quality of the evidence needs to be higher before a court will find such a serious thing happened. It acknowledges the gravity.
So she needed strong evidence. What was the defendant's main defense about the incident itself?
His primary position was he couldn't recall. He claimed he couldn't remember clearly what happened on July 10th, 2016. Couldn't recall if they had sex or anything like the digital penetration she alleged.
Claimed lack of recollection. Given her detailed account and his own texts right after, that seems difficult to believe. This really hits on point 4, assessing credibility when memory or trust is claimed to be lost.
The judge seemed to agree. The judgment called his lack of recollection superficially plausible, because it was years ago, but ultimately lacking credibility on closer look.
Why wasn't it credible? What made the judge doubt him?
A few things. Crucially, the judge noted the defendant could recall other earlier times they had consensual sex. Like, he recalled an instance in October 2015, and his memory of these earlier times was based only on interpreting later text messages where sex wasn't even explicitly mentioned.
So he could remember past encounters based on ambiguous texts, but not this night.
Exactly. The judge found it illogical. How could he remember those, but not the night of July 10th, which involved a heated argument, him getting onto her bed against her wishes, and him sending immediate emotional apologetic texts? The judge reasoned those events should have been far more memorable.
So his selective memory seemed unbelievable to the court.
Pretty much. And because he claimed he couldn't recall, he couldn't offer a credible, competing story of what did happen that night. This was huge. It meant the case basically hinged on evaluating the claimant's evidence, how cogent, consistent, and credible her account was.
Right. So without a credible alternative from him, it all came down to assessing her proof. Point 3, credibility assessment. How did the judge do that, especially given the delay and her complex behavior afterwards?
The judge did a really thorough, multifaceted assessment, detailed over many pages. First, looked at internal consistency. Was her story consistent across different tellings? Her letters from 2020, her formal affidavit for court, her live testimony. The judge found her core account of July 10th was substantially unchanged and consistent.
But the defense pointed out inconsistencies, right? Things like timing, exact words, side of the bed.
Yes, they did. And the judge addressed each one meticulously. For instance, a slight difference in the time she stated, maybe 15-30 months, between her police report and affidavit. Judge found her explanation plausible memory for exact times fades, especially under stress, and giving an account years apart can lead to minor variations. Not proof of lying.
What about the exact words used when she told him to leave? Variations there, too.
Judge called those differences more apparent than real. Whether she said, you should go home, or we're not going to have sex, or no, or get out, the judge found the substance was consistently clear. She withdrew consent, demanded he leave. Recalling precise phrasing years later is tough, but the core message was unambiguous.
There was also something about the sequence of events in a letter to a friend versus her affidavit, like whether she shouted, get out, before or after the alleged penetration.
Yes. In the letter, it seemed like before. In her formal evidence, after. She explained the letter was written at 4 a.m. in distress, aimed at conveying emotional impact to her friend, not a precise court timeline. Judge accepted that, found the broad consistency was that penetration happened after she'd made it clear she wanted him to leave. That crucial consistency was there.
And did it matter if she used the specific term digital penetration when she first told friends?
Her friends couldn't recall if she used those exact words initially. Judge found that totally natural. Victims often use broader terms like assault or he forced himself at first. The specific technical description might come later. Focus is often on the violation, not the precise mechanics.
What about her comment on his dirty clothes on her bed? Defense argued that showed she expected him there.
Judge gave that little weight. Context was key. She'd just told him to leave. Telling him not to put dirty club clothes on her bed was likely another way of saying stay away or get out, not an invitation. And he didn't claim he thought it was consent anyway. He claimed it didn't happen.
Did the judge look at her account of that second, later incident of unwanted contact too?
Yes. She described him putting his hand up her shirt later. Her friend Jeremy recalled her saying her breast was groped in a lift. Judge noted this minor discrepancy actually supported their credibility, suggested independent recollection, not a coached story. And the fact she also delayed processing that incident lent credence to her explanation for the delay with the 2016 event.
So this point-by-point analysis led the judge to find her account fundamentally consistent and believable, accepting explanations for minor variations.
Exactly. It shows how courts assess credibility, not demanding perfection, but looking for overall consistency, plausibility, and whether discrepancies really undermine the core claim.
Then there's the huge delay in reporting. Major point for the defense.
And for the judge. Reaffirming the principle from other cases, the judge said delay by itself doesn't mean you disbelieve someone. You look at the reasons for the delay.
And what reasons did the judge accept from her?
Embarrassment, shame, difficulty articulating it. Crucially, the unsupportive or blaming reactions from some friends when she first confided Judge found that significantly contributed to her feeling trapped, validated her self-blame, made her hesitant to go further.
Plus fears about the social fallout.
Yes, fear of harming him, causing rifts among mutual friends, a big deal in close circles like in Singapore, fear of backlash from him, and even a period of rationalizing he wasn't a threat anymore since he was in a new relationship later.
Very understandable human fears and struggles.
Judge found them entirely reasonable, valid reasons for the delay, consistent with trauma responses, didn't undermine her credibility.
Okay, finally on credibility, let's touch on point 5, potential for fraud or fabricated claims. Did the defense suggest she made it all up?
They suggested a motive, that she fabricated it because he had lost romantic interest in her after pursuing her for 18 months, and this case was her way of not losing in that dynamic.
How did the judge address that possibility of fabrication, the court's role as a safeguard?
The judge specifically considered this suggested motive and found it considerably difficult to accept.
Why? Why was that motive implausible?
The judge pointed to the long delay and the indirect route she took. If it was just spite or resentment, why wait years? Why go through mind-death first, not even naming him initially? It seemed a really convoluted way to act at a romantic peak. The judge felt the motive just didn't fit her actions or the timeline.
So the rigorous look at motive, combined with assessing her consistency, explanations, corroborating texts, that's how the court tried to distinguish a genuine claim from a potentially fabricated one.
Exactly. The thorough credibility assessment is the main safeguard against false claims in civil court. It's a deep dive into all the circumstances.
It really shows the court doesn't just take things at face value. Okay, so after all that analysis, what was the judge's final finding on liability? Did the battery happen?
The judge concluded her account was cogent and convincing, corroborated by the texts, consistent overall. Her behavior and delay were adequately explained.
And the defendant's lack of recall?
Found not credible. And since he offered no credible alternative, the judge found she had proven the tort of battery occurred on the balance of probabilities, meeting that requirement for cogent evidence.
So the judge was satisfied the non-consensual digital penetration happened, as she described. Okay, so liability established. Then the court had to figure out damages. What was she asking for?
Claims for pain and suffering, loss of amenities, psychiatric harm, maybe aggravated or punitive damages, medical costs, and lost earnings.
Let's start with general battery damages. Does that require physical injury?
No, the source clarifies it doesn't. Damages can be for injury to feelings of indignity, mental suffering, humiliation, distress, anger caused by the battery.
Okay, so for pain and suffering specifically.
Judge awarded $25,000. She gave evidence of immediate pain and later emotional distress. Her friend Jeremy corroborated observing her distress. Judge looked at a UK case for guidance, but noted differences. This was a solitary incident, prognosis seemed favorable long-term, no immediate psychiatric meds needed, which factored into the $25K amount.
What about loss of amenities? Claiming it affected her relationships with men, trust, clothing choices.
Judge had some difficulty fully accepting this. Noted she could confide in male friends, even tried to rekindle things with the defendant himself. Didn't suggest a total impairment interacting with men. While she explained relationships failed because she couldn't let men get close, the judge didn't make a separate award for this. probably rolled into the general damages.
She also claimed for psychiatric harm based on an adjustment disorder diagnosis from a Dr. Lee years later. Did the court accept that diagnosis for damages?
No, ultimately the judge did not rely on that specific diagnosis of adjustment disorder as being legally caused by the 2016 incident for this particular head of damages.
Why not? She clearly suffered distress.
Several reasons. One, the assessment was over 6 years later, very retrospective. Two, adjustment disorder usually needs symptoms within 3 months of the stressor. Dr. Lee's reports lacked detail on onset severity in that time frame back in 2016. Three, lack of contemporaneous evidence from 2016 showing that level of functional impairment then.
So even if the 2016 event contributed to later issues.
Right. The judge accepted Dr. Lee's view that the 2016 incident materially contributed to her later symptoms. But the specific diagnosis of adjustment disorder, with its strict criteria tied to the 3-month window, wasn't proven as directly linked for this specific damages claim years later.
Okay, what about aggravated damages? For enhanced hurt due to his malice or conduct.
Judge declined to award those. Didn't find evidence of malice or spite or contumelious conduct in the act itself. Saw it as an isolated incident within their complex relationship dynamic, not driven by a malicious intent from the outset, even though his actions were wrong.
But the judge did award punitive damages. Why punish him in a civil case? This relates to point 4 and 6 maybe legal system's role when criminal action doesn't proceed.
Yes, $20,000 in punitive damages. These aren't to compensate her, but to punish him, deter others, and show the court's strong disapproval. Judge found the $25,000 compensatory award was inadequate for punishment.
What warranted punishment here?
The act itself. Digital penetration, judge said, is a profound breach of personal autonomy, a deep violation of bodily integrity. Punitive damages were needed to mark disapproval, censure him, deter others. Judge highlighted their role in civil law for enforcing rights like bodily autonomy, especially when criminal prosecution doesn't happen. It provides a legal consequence.
That makes sense. Civil court providing accountability. What about medical expenses?
She claimed about $8,700 for costs incurred between 2020 and 2023, homeopathy, aware counseling, therapy clinic.
Were those allowed, given they were years later and after that other 2020 incident?
Yes, judge allowed the full amount. Accepted Dr. Lee's evidence, which wasn't challenged on this point, that while the 2020 incident might have been the trigger for seeking therapy then, the 2016 incident was the greater and primary factor behind her persistent underlying issues that were aggravated later.
So a causal link was found showing the long-term impact of the 2016 battery.
Exactly. Underscores the lasting harm.
Future medical expenses.
Disallowed. Not enough detail on cost duration. Also, given the favorable prognosis mentioned and the adjustment disorder diagnosis not being strictly linked for damages, this claim wasn't sufficiently supported.
And finally, pre-trial loss of earnings after she left MindDef.
Also disallowed. Key reason. Lack of medical evidence proving her resignation and unemployment at that time were caused by a psychiatric condition resulting from the 2016 tort.
Even though she testified it was difficult emotionally.
Yes. Judge noted contradictions her letter saying she left due to disappointment, no evidence of underperformance, no medical advice supporting inability to work then due to the 2016 event. Lack of detail on job search plus LinkedIn showed entrepreneurial activity. Judge found she didn't prove that specific financial loss was legally caused by his act years earlier.
So even finding the battery occurred and caused harm needing later treatment, the specific loss of earnings wasn't proven as a direct legal consequence.
Precisely. Shows the need to strictly prove causation for special damages.
Okay, so summing up damages. $25,000 pain suffering, $25,000 punitive, roughly $8.07 medical. Total around $53,700 plus interest.
That's the final monetary outcome based on the findings.
Wow, this case really is a deep dive into so many complex issues: consent, trauma, memory, law. Let's try to synthesize the key lessons for you, the listener, especially thinking about Singapore's multicultural context. Hits on points 1 through 6 we wanted to cover.
Definitely. At its core, it's a stark reminder about consent. The absolute need to respect someone's right to change their mind at any point, even if they initially agreed, even in a past intimate relationship. The fact this happened after she withdrew consent is key. No means no. Being asked to leave means leave.
Huge lesson for relationships, point 6. Boundaries aren't fixed. Communication helps, but this case shows distress can make that hard. The onus is on ensuring consent is there.
And it powerfully shows the varied, often non-stereotypical ways victims react. Point 2. The shock, denial, self-blame, delay. The judge accepting this, citing precedent, is crucial against harmful myths about how victims should act.
Hmm.
Maybe broader conversations like Me Too helped her and help us understand.
The difficulty navigating social circles after is also clear. The pressure to keep friendships, avoid rifts, very real in close-knit Singaporean society where professional and personal lives often mix.
Point 4. Burden of proof and lost trust memory. Her burden was to prove it, but his claimed lack of recall, found not credible, was significant. Judge's reasoning on why his memory claim failed shows how critical credibility assessment is when someone says, "I don't remember." It's not a free pass.
And point 5, potential for false claims or fraud. The defense suggested she fabricated it out of resentment. Judge scrutinized that motive carefully. The detailed analysis of her consistency, actions, timeline, corroboration, that's the safeguard. How the system tries to sort genuine claims from malicious ones.
And grounding it in Singapore? Point 6 again. The settings are familiar. Mind-deaf, clubs, shared rides, mutual friends, the social pressures, the overlapping circles relatable here. And the judgment shows Singapore's legal system applying its principles to these deeply personal harms.
So while it's one specific case, the lessons feel universal, don't they? Consent, trauma responses, disclosure challenges, how courts weigh evidence when trust is broken. The judge's reasoning gives a framework for understanding reactions that might seem confusing at first.
Absolutely. A reminder that actions in a moment can echo for years. And seeking justice can be a long, hard road, personal, social, legal hurdles.
So for you, our listener, here's a final thought to maybe mull over from this deep dive. This case shows how actions within even previously intimate relationships can have profound, lasting impacts, and highlights the immense challenges of processing trauma and seeking justice years later. What responsibility do we all have to ensure consent is present, clear, and respected at every single step? And how can we, as a society, as friends, better support those who've experienced violations whenever they feel ready or able to share?
Really crucial questions for all of us as we navigate our own relationships and interactions.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what was a challenging but really important case. We hope unpacking the details, the human side, and the judge's thinking has given you some valuable insights.
The nuances are huge, and understanding them, well, that's key to building a more informed and maybe more empathetic society.
You can find the deep dive wherever you listen. Until next time.